interruption. All right. 5 seconds, inshallah. All right. So to continue is that the Quran actually, or the Hadith, they actually use a number of different terms. So even calling a certain matter as fahisha, or calling it a name that shows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not accepting such an action, that's another form of, which is in nahi, that's another form of asking you to abstain from such an action or such a behavior or that item. So when you see the hadith saying fajtanibu, that's the first thing, is that what we learn from this is that number one, is that any matter that the Prophet ﷺ himself, and this is another thing that we learn, is that number one, that the Prophet ﷺ, meaning the sunnah itself, meaning the Prophet, peace be upon him, can also act as shara, can also act as the one to obligate something or to prohibit something. And I saw, I don't want to mention the names, but we're seeing a trend of people rejecting the sunnah or rejecting hadith and saying that it is sunnah, meaning, and what they mean by that is that it is liked, it is something, it's a plus, it's not mandatory to follow the sunnah. But you can see here that even the Prophet ﷺ, مَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْهُ, meaning that the Prophet, peace be upon him, he himself said, what I ordered you to do, then do, and what I prevented you from doing, then abstain from that. Now, what we see from here is that the Prophet ﷺ himself acts as masdar min masadar al-tashri', as a resource for the epistemology and as a resource for a Muslim definition of right, wrong, justice, injustice, and the list goes on and on. The other part, fajtanibu would also tell us that when it comes to the different ways of expressing that you should abstain from something, it can also come to وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, what I ordered you to do. In other words, even the hadith, even the Prophet ﷺ can also act as a resource to obligate certain matters. In terms of doing a certain action, or also from the area of legislating certain matters. فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Now here's the other segment of it, because when we're actually talking about what to consider in terms of priority, the priority is to abstain from the major sins, from the things that are haram, because it would be extremely hard to do a lot of the different obligatory things if you did not abstain from it. This is how I usually explain it to kids. If you actually want to go up in any way, in order to go up and elevate yourself, you have to push down. In order to jump, you have to push down against the gravity in order to go up and elevate yourself. Same thing. In order to go up in your spiritual elevation, you need to go against the different gravities that your body can have in order to pull you towards this mundane world. And the different gravities can include the different eating and drinking, can also include the different egos, the different ego that we might have, our own selfishness, our own personal center. All those areas can act as barriers from us living up to the principle. So we end up living down to our own desires, and our own desires includes the sexual desires, our own focus on ourselves in order to get people's focus on us and to make ourselves feel that that focus and that we're the center of things. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us, the first thing is that abstain from those matters that will take your spirituality down. And those things are actually within yourself, within your ego, within your desire. You desire fame, you desire to keep property, you desire liberty and freedom and unsanctioned freedom. All these different things can be those areas that may take you into another end. So you start with that. You start with fixing your ego. You start with fixing your own matters. وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ, and what I ordered you to do as much as you can. When it comes to فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, do as much as you can. But what does that mean? Because when you say فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, people have different capacities. People have different capacities to do what they're required to do. The capacity can mean to stay on the obligations. The obligations are limited. The obligations, I thought in microwave. The obligations are limited. The obligations start with the pillars, and then the obligations would go for the other parts of faith that complete the pillars, the other matters that would complete the pillars. But in the end is that the sunnah is basically siyaj al-fara'id. So sunnah is just like the gate. It's the fence to keep those obligations intact and to keep you up on the pace of growing, but in order to make sure that you don't transgress the limits of your own pillars, and without you realizing, probably risking losing even the pillars by losing your sunan, by losing the supererogatory or the extra items that Islam is asking you to do. The other part that we're seeing is that فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ is that in general, every single order, if it is extremely harsh or you feel that it is beyond your capacity, you want to remember there's always going to be a rukhsa. There's always going to be that place where you will be granted some level of rukhsa, some level of excuse, but on a condition is that the rukhsa that you will be granted is that indeed it was beyond your capacity. Now, what does it mean to be beyond your capacity, and who determines if it is beyond the capacity or not? The one to determine beyond the capacity is basically the scholar. The scholar is the one. The scholar is the one to determine if something is beyond your capacity or not, in where they're going to consider different matters, such as, is this something beyond your capacity religiously? And then they'll have the specialty to re-examine and see if you do have a darura, if you do have a necessity, to give up, or at least temporarily not practice that or obligation because of a harsh or maybe a hardship that you are facing due to some religious issue, or whether it is because of a personal harm, meaning bodily harm, or whether it was something that is psychological harm, or whether that was a family issue, or whether that was a financial hardship. But that is to be determined by the scholars to make sure that you're not going off track with your own iman, thinking that, oh, I can't do it, therefore it is outside of my capacity. And this happens many times and frequently, when people would make their own fatwa and think, well, I can't do this, therefore I could just leave it and move on with my life because Islam is easy. Many times, and this is a word that kalimatu haqqan yuradu biha batil. It could be a word of truth, but it is used in the wrong context. Using it in the wrong context can sometimes lead you to a delusion and a deviation without you realizing. So وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. And what I ordered you to do as much as you're able to, but you must go back to the scholars in order to see if this matter also includes you in where you could reduce some of the obligation until you gradually grow with your iman and your ability to implement other matters. فَإِنَّمَا أَهْلَكَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ فَإِنَّمَا أَهْلَكَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ahlaka, the word ahlaka would mean to destruct. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destructed the nations before us because of two items he mentions. كَثْرَةُ مَسَائِلِهِمْ. Their constant questioning. What is questioning? It is not that they're asking for the sake of getting an answer for something, but كَثْرَةُ مَسَائِلِهِمْ, always trying to negotiate the matters. I'm going to unmute Fabina. Fabina, you had a question. All right. Wa alaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Go ahead.
Sorry, Sister Aysha. This question, I am not asking, somebody asked me this question, and I did not know how to, explain to the person. I know we have done in Sunnah as well, when we see the person, basically, she asked me that, okay, I am studying Sunnah and I'm studying the Quran. So now if I'm doing in the Sunnah, if it is said for the men that you have to keep a beard, and if you're not going to do it, does that mean I'm not following the Sunnah? Or if I'm not, or like any of the Sunnah aspects, if I'm not able to do it, or if I think it is not necessary for me, does that mean I'm not following the Quran? Does that implement on my being in my faith?
A number of things to say is that many times people think that if we say something is a sunnah, they would confuse and think that it means do not do. When we say sunnah, sunnah actually has several meanings to it. Sunnah can mean the resource, and meaning that it comes from the resource of hadith, which can obligate or can forbid something. And the word sunnah can also be from a different angle, depending on the context, can also mean that something is not obligatory, but it is recommended. So when we say something is recommended, that would mean that it's best if you do. But on the example of beard, for example, there are differences of opinions between scholars on whether the men's beard is obligatory or whether it's sunnah, although I consider the preponderant ruling is that it's obligatory. But just to keep that in mind, we cannot compare one sunnah to another and say, well, I'm going to here consider it as a sunnah, I'm going to move on. That's more of a scholar's duty in order to help us research whether such a matter I can kind of delay practicing it until I'm ready or I am strong enough to practice such a matter or not. And this could be very deceiving at many times, because we can convince ourselves, and we do have the potential to convince ourselves that, oh, I'm not ready now. And then we don't realize that once we keep procrastinating, that we're going to continue doing that procrastination, and we will never feel it is the right time to do it, because we will end up maintaining our level of iman at a low level, and we would never realize that we need to add the sunnah. You see, when it comes to your spirituality, you increase by you putting the effort to increase. By you reclining and thinking that, oh, I'll do this next year, this is part of the decrease that is going to be acting as a barrier from you increasing your iman. And that's called it taswif. Taswif is when you keep procrastinating and you keep on saying, I'll do this next year. I'll probably do it after I graduate, or maybe I'll do it after I get married, or maybe I'll do it after I get a job. And without you realizing, time is running, life is passing by, and then when you don't realize, death will be coming there, and you did not achieve what you had promised yourself that you would achieve. So I hope I answered that one. Now to continue, فإنما أهلك الذين من قبلكم. Yep. فإنما أهلك.
So this is how I should answer her. How should I, sort of give her the answer that yes, it is mandatory. Sunnah is mandatory, and then therefore, if she cannot do it, so she's asking that will I be considered I'm out of being in an iman state if you don't.
So there are a number of things here. Is that although yes, if something is really a sunnah, it's not mandatory to do, then it is something that would be still within the state of recommendation. But here's one thing, is that the Prophet, the Sahaba, they didn't understand the word sunnah, meaning recommended, to mean that it's a don't do. But they actually understood the word sunnah as an extra bonus, as an extra credit matter that I have to put in the effort to practice. That's why Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-Khattab, for example, he was trying to imitate the Prophet ﷺ in the way he was drinking, in the way he was walking, in the way that he was even tying his own camel in a certain area. And people would look at him like, what a lunatic, why would he do such a thing? There's no reason to it. But he was so keen on implementing and practicing the sunnah that he was even doing what is not even mandatory to practice. He was practicing each and every single corner of it. So in general, yes, there are certain matters. For example, maybe doing qiyam al-layl. Is that person ready to do qiyam al-layl? Put in the effort and you will grow. All those different matters are supposed to help you grow in your iman. If you don't teach yourself how to grow, if you don't push yourself to grow, you will stay at one level without you realizing. And that's why it's very important to listen even to the people around you when they might tell you, sister, I really noticed that your iman, or the way you're practicing, or you really changed. Can we sit together and probably do something, and maybe increase our dhikr time, maybe do something, without us realizing it. We can live in a delusion and convince ourselves that no, everything is fine, I just grew spiritually, when in reality the person puts himself in a delusion, and they're actually going backwards in their spiritual elevation. Let's continue. فإنما أهلك الذين من قبلكم, meaning the people that were before you were destructed, not because كثرة مسائلهم. It's not that Islam is against people asking questions, but here كثرة مسائلهم, meaning that they were not keen on knowing the ruling, but they were actually keen on arguing. كثرة مسائلهم is arguing the matters, arguing about the ruling. It's not that they were asking for the sake of knowing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ruling is. In fact, the ayat, يسألونك عن المحيض, يسألونك عن الأهلة, the ayat were revealed that many times, saying that this is what they're asking you about. They're asking you about the cycle. Here's the ruling regarding the cycles. They're asking you about the crescents. This is what it means. Those questions, and caring about asking a question, was actually something that is praised. But many of the times, and this can be a confusion, where many times they would hear that there were instances where the Sahaba were afraid to ask questions, but that was because they were afraid that was like arguing with the Prophet ﷺ. So whenever an Arabi is like somebody that is from the Bedouins, would come over to ask questions, all the Sahaba would just gather to hear as he asked the questions, what the Prophet ﷺ was going to respond in, and what his response was going to look like. We see that here, كثرة مسائلهم, arguing the matters, and without us realizing, there's, I don't want to say the name, but there's this YouTuber who seems like he had some kind of a background in learning Islam, and now claims to be a Maliki madhab, and is right now questioning a lot of the different things. In fact, going against all the ijma'at, going against all the hadith, going against a number of different nusus, a number of different texts that were mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah, going against them and finding a way. Here's the hard part about it, is that he will find a way to reinterpret the matters in a way where it sounds very liberal, in a way where it sounds like it is what Islam wants. You see, this happens many times, where people would take a lot of different interpretations and say that that's what Islam calls for, or say that this is a different interpretation or a scholarly interpretation, but without them realizing it is actually arguing, it is actually going against or distancing oneself away from the interpretation and the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had explained the different matters in. وَاخْتِلَافُهُمْ عَلَىٰ أَنْبِيَائِهِمْ. وَاخْتِلَافُهُمْ عَلَىٰ أَنْبِيَائِهِمْ would mean الاختلاف. الاختلاف, the word الاختلاف can have several meanings. الاختلاف to mean to object. الاختلاف can mean to reject as well. Object, reject, and can also mean to refuse, can also mean to go against a certain matter. And this is اختلافهم على أنبيائهم, so that they were doing things totally different. They were anti their prophet's path. They were going and interpreting things differently. And sisters, please remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in Surah al-Bayyinah that the first deviation happened not in changing or rejecting the words of the Prophet's words. The first deviation actually happened in reinterpreting the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet's words, reinterpreting them in a way that suits their desires. Reinterpreting the matters, reinterpreting the orders is the first way of deviation. Without one may realize, one starts out by convincing themselves that they're still on the right path, that they're still doing the right thing. They just have a different way of choosing the words. And the Prophet ﷺ actually said in the Hadith, إِنَّ مِنَ الْبَيَانِ لَسِحْرًا. Some eloquence may be like magic. It may create a delusion. It may seem very eloquent. It may seem very catchy. It may seem like it has a good way of words, but without you realizing, it is actually a very deviant. It is actually a very deviant interpretation away from the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and away from the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it all started out with a good way of putting things, a good eloquence, which makes it seem like it is exactly what God Almighty wanted. And this is why al-ikhtilaf ala al-anbiya actually starts with the wrong interpretation, and the wrong interpretation comes from lack of ilm. The lack of ilm is what brings in the wrong interpretation. How do we get the ilm? How do we get to the right interpretation? We get to the right interpretation by making sure that we have a comprehensive view, a comprehensive understanding of Quran, comprehensive understanding of sunnah. But of course, most of us did not memorize the Quran, did not memorize 500,000 hadith, and did not even have the tool to distinguish one hadith stronger than the other, or one hadith having a illah, or one hadith having a certain weakness. So if we don't have that capacity, that's why we turn to the scholars to make sure that we have a whole chain of not narration, but we have a whole chain of the right interpretation that was interpreted in a certain way by the Prophet ﷺ, and that's how the Sahaba themselves understood the interpretation, and we're not making our own interpretation that suits our own desires. When we look at al-ikhtilaf al-anbiya, meaning objecting and doing things totally different from the prophet's way, we end up without us realizing on a totally different path. The Prophet ﷺ drew one line and he said, this is the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and drew many lines and he said, and those are the paths of shaitan. Those are the paths of deviation. And that's the same thing, is that without you realizing, in the beginning, you might think you're really close to the main axis. You're really close to the main message of the main message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. But it isn't until you go farther that you realize you have gone very far from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is al-ikhtilaf ala al-anbiya. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ calls that people are going away and distancing themselves away from the path of the prophets and away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Having that being said, when we look at Islamic legislature, we could see what we learn from this hadith is that Islamic legislature goes into different levels. Number one is that knowing who your prophet is. The prophet, and of course the prophet had come with messages, and here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the Quran, and the sunnah itself acts as the second resource. That even in this hadith we could see that the prophet himself is affirming and confirming that even the sunnah is actually one of the resources for legislature. It is not a secondary resource, but it is even on the same level of the Quran itself in terms of legislature. Why? Because even the Quran, even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ, and obey Allah and obey the Prophet. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says that whatever the Prophet forbids you from doing, then that is forbidden, and what he orders you to do, then do. And this tells us that the Quran, in terms of legislation, the Quran and the Sunnah are actually on the same level of legislation. But when we say the same level of legislation, that would mean that we would look on the other part, which is definitely the Quran is what is called mutawatir in terms of the level of authenticity. We had a large group of people narrate and actually collect the Quran orally in groups and large groups of numbers that heard the Quran. But when it comes to the Sunnah, we have different levels of authenticity. The different levels of authenticity would actually help us at many times, and help the scholars specifically to see how obligatory or how mandatory such a matter is. But that is based on the scholars that is based on the scholars ilm, that is based on the scholars knowledge, and they would be the ones to determine whether this is sunnah or whether this is obligatory. And here's the thing, is that indeed at many times there can be differences of opinions on a certain matter in the level of obligation. So the Hanafi madhab might actually regard even the word obligatory, might actually regard that no, an obligation has a certain definition, a certain way, versus the majority will actually look at it differently. Let's take an example. With examples, things become clear. Salat al-Witr. Salat al-Witr for the Hanafi madhab, it's actually wajib. The word wajib would mean obligatory. For the majority of the scholars, they'll regard that Salat al-Witr is not obligatory, but they will regard it as sunnah mu'akkada, that it is highly recommended. Doesn't mean that it's not to do. The Sahaba didn't even look and study those matters as how recommended is it, let's discuss it. They understood the Prophet ﷺ wanted us to do, and simple, I'm just going to do it. But later generations, they more wanted to see when it comes to obligation, when it comes to the level of mandation, and that has good reasons to it. So it's not, oh, this is not a bid'ah to study, wajib, fard, sunnah, mustahab. This is not a bid'ah. Don't misunderstand and think that this is an innovation, but different circumstances required that the scholars would dig more to see how mandated is it. But when it comes to your spiritual enhancement, that's totally different than when you're talking about certain legislation to work on the amount of mandation, the amount of effort I should put, etc. So just to keep note that when we look at the different opinions between scholars on certain matters, don't confuse yourself, and remember that it is simply because they may find a certain wording in a hadith that may increase the level of mandation or decrease its level of maybe tahrim, or decrease the level of prohibition. So how mandated, how prohibited is it? But in the end, they do have those levels to see what does wujub mean, what is wajib. How do we know if something is obligatory? How do we know if something is haram? And that is the science of usul al-fiqh. That is the science of usul al-fiqh, which we can translate it in English, the principles of fiqh, or the fundamentals of fiqh, in where we would look at every single term. In fact, even certain words, certain letters, we will use in order to examine how mandated is that matter. And that requires lots of ilm in Lugha Arabiya. And usul al-fiqh is actually harder than fiqh, just to let you know. Usul al-fiqh, that science is even harder than fiqh, because it goes farther. Every usuli can be a faqih, but not every faqih can be an usuli. Not the opposite. Because when you study usul al-fiqh, you study the intricate words, you study the intricate details of how mandated. How do I prove that something is a resource or not? How do I prove is that wording referring or determining that I should use or do such a matter or not? Lots of things to say, but I'll leave some time for questions right now before we end our class in 4 minutes. So if somebody has any question, you can go ahead and raise your hand. Oh, actually, there are some questions on the side. What time do we start? Yeah, so we start at 5 and we end at 6. So we have 4 minutes left. So if somebody has any questions, right, I love that. So somebody shared on Facebook, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. The ayah actually says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ankabut, those that jahadu fina means they put an effort. But the word jahadu fina is more, it's like this, those that put an effort, even if it is one small effort, لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open many paths of guidance in order to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just put one effort. One effort could be a sunnah. It could be an effort to make that obligation, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will actually open the paths of spiritual elevation without you realizing. Just put the effort, even if you may not do it. The Prophet ﷺ actually says, "Man hamma bihasana." Whoever just, the word is ham. Ham means you just put it as an intention. You intended to do something. You attempted to do something. You just put it there that I'm going to do this. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you even if you did not implement that what you had intended to do, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for it. But you just start with that intention. Just start that I'm going to do something here. I'm going to start practicing, maybe memorizing half a page a day, or maybe doing a donation, or maybe doing qiyam al-layl, just 2 rak'ahs a night. When if I would wake up in the middle of the night, just put it as an intention, and it will be something that will change in the future and change who you are. But you have to put the effort. Don't expect al-wahi to come to you and tell you that it is now time for you to add something new to it. Guidance has been sent. It is just you, and up to you to decide, do I want to put the step and take that moment and seize the moment of life to make a change in my life and elevate my spirituality, or not? So if there's any other question, so go ahead and ask it, and before we sign off, inshallah. All right, so we'll leave it here, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.